Notebook 14. In the blood-soaked mud of the Somme. From the 1st of November 1916 to the 30th of January 1917. Part 1. It was night-time when Barthas and his gun team reached the front line in the Somme. As the earth-shattering Allied bombardment raged, the orders were passed down the dark, cold, muddy trench. It had been kept secret until the very last moment. The Corps would launch an attack on the German lines the very next day. The men were exhausted, hungry, and covered in mud. They greeted the order with grumbling. Many slipped away from the front lines under excuses of being overwhelmed by shell fire, of being ill, or of having frozen feet. Excuses which were not necessarily true. These men were not fond of the idea of a bayonet charge, and so they stayed low as soon as they reached the field kitchens or first aid stations. Others simply got lost in the trenches and did not put much effort into finding the right path. Barthas wrote that not everyone could be a hero. The night passed, and it was the morning of November 1st. At 9 a.m. the order was given to go over the top. There was a moment of hesitation among the poilus, but to their left the 125th Regiment charged forth with great energy and passed right over the first German line. Seeing themselves outflanked, the Germans immediately ran out of their dugouts with their arms raised to the air and screaming, "Comrades! Comrades!" A word which Barthas wrote was now known in all the languages of the world. Some comical scenes occurred. There existed rivalry between the 296th and 125th Regiments over who could gather the most prisoners, and so the confused Germans were pulled one way to the other. They did not know where to go, and in confusion watched the animated discussions between the French soldiers, which sometimes degenerated into arguments that came close to fistfights. Some of the Germans took advantage of the chaos to slip away or hide in shell holes. And, in this way, the German prisoners and the first line were easily taken. The German military command had not even noticed this loss, as the land was still covered in dense fog. Barthas wrote that a leader with any initiative could have taken advantage of this to easily take the second line as well, but no one could find the general or the colonel. With the prospect of an attack, they had apparently buried themselves in some deep and safe hole, and so the Corps stayed put. At noon the fog lifted, and the Germans noticed the loss of their front line. They did not launch a counterattack, but they did bombard them heavily with shells of all caliber, causing significant casualties. The day passed. On the 2nd and 3rd of November, heavy downpours and sharp cold broke out, making life for the poilus in these trenches even more difficult. They not only had to carry out long hours of guard duty and patrols, but were also sent to dig and carry out work details day and night without sleep and with only meager food. At last, on the night of the 3rd to the 4th, their regiment received the order for relief. At 6 in the morning, Barthas's group and the 4th Battalion to which they were attached arrived at the town of Hardecourt, where they were supposed to get onto trucks. The men were completely exhausted, but still they had to march for 2 more hours to reach the town of Suzanne, as the traffic jams were such that it was impossible for the trucks that were supposed to meet them to reach Hardecourt. Suzanne had once been a pretty little village with some fine chateaux. The German shells had damaged the town greatly and still continued to do so despite the Allied advance. When the poilus arrived, they had to wait for the others that had fallen behind due to exhaustion, injury, or frozen feet. Barthas took advantage of this free time to walk around the town. The village's church had been hit by shell fire. The steeple was still intact, but half of the vaulting had collapsed. The inhabitants had cleared away the rubble, and the wounded church was still used for regular services. Barthas saw that in the chapel there were buried several generations of counts, dukes, marquises, lieutenants, and captains-at-arms that had been lords of that region. He also managed to visit a beautiful chateau near the church with ornamented staircases, galleries, paneling, and tapestries. Finally, at 10 a.m. all the regiment was together. The poilus got onto the trucks and they headed out. 5 hours later they were dropped off at the small village of Aubigny, right next to the river Somme. The billet assigned to them was a huge barn in a terrible state. The place was extremely filthy. The only furniture consisted of planks along the sides of the building. Each plank had some scraps of straw and served as their bed. The walls were of wattle and daub, and were full of holes through which countless cold draughts entered. Much like the walls, the roof was also full of holes through which fell the rain, forming a large pond at the bottom of the barn. To add to this, the ground sloped down from the courtyard where a large manure pile was located. The water seeped through the manure, and the filthy juices that were extracted from it were fed into the pond in their billets. And Barthas wrote of how, every day, the newspapers exalted the great comforts and cleanliness which the soldiers enjoyed when returning from the trenches. He wrote that at least they received a second blanket, which, even though it made their packs heavier during marches, helped them in protecting them from the very cold nights, as during that time the weather was very bad with rain, snow, and heavy frosts. In the courtyard along one of the barn's walls were tethered the company's mules. The poor beasts were completely exposed. Resigned, they bore these terrible conditions. Barthas wrote how they did not inspire any pity from the others because they were simple beasts, as if animals did not suffer like men, and he wondered where the Society for the Protection of Animals was at that time. The poilus leaders took great care to not tell them the casualty figures for the regiment, but Barthas wrote that it wouldn't be an exaggeration to set them at 200 dead, 300 wounded, and 100 evacuated. For perspective, this would have been around 20% casualties if the regiment had been at full strength, which it almost certainly was not. Anyway, from the 7th of November onwards, their divisional depots sent all the reinforcements they could to try and replace the 296th losses. These reinforcements consisted of 200 men that had been little more than bakery workers, pastry chefs, and typists who had now been replaced by people who had been lucky enough to have been born 2 or 3 years earlier than them. Barthas wrote that of these reinforcements very few were from southern France, and so the regiment continued to slowly lose its southern character. For the next several days at assembly, the divisional general, the brigade general, and the colonel took turns congratulating each other and exalting the battalion's courage and war virtues, to the concealed laughter of all the poilus. They announced with pride that their battalion had advanced 1,200 meters, taken 256 prisoners, and captured 3 machine guns. The commandant asked that this be celebrated by having the battalion be officially cited in the orders of the army, but the higher-ups considered that this would humiliate the other battalions, and it was not done. Barthas wrote that one would have to shed a tear that it would not be recorded for posterity, how they had taken 1 kilometer of swampy ground, and 256 Germans who had eagerly waited for their arrival so they could surrender. But despite all these congratulations, Colonel Robert was quick to remind the poilus of their station as mere soldiers by unleashing a slew of new draconian prescriptions and regulations. He set down new, severe punishments for anyone who lost his tools, lost his weapons, lost his rations, got lost in the trenches, left the trenches without authorization, or reported sick and was not recognized as sick. To make an example, some men that had been unlucky enough to have committed some of these infractions were sent to court-martial. Additionally, there was a small purge of officers, as Barthas wrote how a commandant called Cantegril was unceremoniously placed on the inactive list and taken away from the regiment, apparently because he had been too sensitive to the plight of, and had cared too much about the lives of, his men. Another lieutenant called Oragne from the 14th Company was demoted to sergeant for unclear reasons. Oragne had taken command of the company when Lieutenant Cordier had been wounded, and apparently it had been judged he lacked the necessary decisiveness and cold-bloodedness. Together with these new measures, the training exercises returned with a vengeance, being carried out every day no matter the weather. Barthas wrote that this was necessary to try and shape up their new reinforcements of cooks and bakers. The poor fellows had the spirit of men going to the gallows. For Barthas and the other poilus, it was amusing to look at their poor state, as the small village of Aubigny had precious few distractions besides a tavern which could barely fit a dozen people. To pass the evenings, some men played cards by candlelight, others caught up on sleep, and most headed out to spend a few hours in nearby villages that had more to offer in the way of taverns and restaurants. 2 kilometers upstream there was a pretty little town called Corbie, but to reach it one had to cross the river at a bridge where several English sentries were stationed, and whom forbid passage to all without the proper military authorization. The town was reserved for use by the English army. Its shops were full of products from the other side of the channel, and all the signs were written in English. But the poilus were not discouraged, and soon found a way to enter the town. They went down the road 200 or 300 meters away from the bridge with the sentinels, and waited for an English vehicle to pass by. When one did appear, they climbed onto its back, and concealed themselves among all the material. The drivers willingly went along with this, and they easily entered the town where they could enjoy themselves. Getting out was trivial, as they only had to walk. The sentinels did not give them a second glance. At Corbie, the poilus discovered that the town had been occupied by the Germans in September 1914. Though all the inhabitants agreed that they had been very respectful and had paid for everything they took. The poilus ended up spending 2 weeks in that region, and had the misfortune that during those days the moon was full, so there were nightly visits by German aircraft. The poilus would lie down for sleep, and moments later hear the sinister rumbling of the engines flying over them. Soon after, they would hear the explosions from the bombs the planes dropped near Corbie and Amiens. Some cannons would fire up into the night sky, but the planes only left when the sun rose. Then, on the 19th of November, the order suddenly came for the 5th and 6th battalions to leave for the front lines. Barthas's own 4th battalion would head out the next day. Their superiors reassured them that the regiment would only be heading into the trenches to prepare the sector for relief by the British Army. But by this time, the poilus had wisened up to their tricks, and the mood was grim. They all knew that they would be heading towards suffering, horror, and possibly death. That same day, the chief of Barthas's gun team, Sergeant Gauthier, had the extremely good fortune of being sent on home leave, and he left Barthas in charge. Barthas was not honored by this new responsibility. And with this, on the 20th of November at 10 a.m., The poilus got onto trucks and headed for the trenches. After the trip by truck, they marched 3 hours and, by 6 p.m., reached a reserve trench near the town of Comble. Barthas' team was the last to arrive, and there was no shelter for them. Fortunately, their lieutenant, Loriot, allowed them to pull back to the town of Hardecourt until the battalion was called to the front lines. That night, Barthas and his comrades had to sleep wrapped in their blankets under the trucks. It was a long, freezing night. The cold woke them up very early. To try and warm themselves, they dug a hole that was 2 meters wide by 1 deep and covered it with their tent cloths. It was a very unstable shelter which would have easily flooded if it had rained, but it protected them from the cold wind and damp fog. While they were preparing this small shelter, a soldier that was passing by asked them if they were digging a grave. In answer to their shocked looks, the soldier pointed out 6 freshly dug mounds that were but a few paces away. They were the graves of 6 men of the 296th Regiment who had been killed the day before. It turned out that Barthas' team had dug their shelter in the Hardecourt cemetery. The cemetery itself was a sad sight. Huge shells had fallen and pulverized the dead in it. Still, Barthas wrote that it was only a matter of time for the cemetery to be repopulated with fresh corpses. Barthas and the men of his team were no longer bothered by the idea of sleeping among the dead, and so they stayed there. Near their graveyard shelter there was a devastated house. Among its ruins there was a small cellar. This cellar had previously been used by the Germans as a machine gun nest. It only had one way in or out, and when the French had taken the town, they discovered that some German machine gunners had been locked with key in that place with no way out. Barthas wondered if the poilus that took the town rescued the machine gunners or slaughtered them. Now this cellar was the place for the simple, peaceful field kitchen of the Paysan François Maisonneuve. The next day, Barthas went out to explore the village. At one point, he saw a thin line of smoke and smelled the delicious aroma of rabbit stew coming from some ruins. When he approached, he discovered a half-buried cellar with his friend, the cook Richardi, working among his pots and pans preparing the meals for the officers he had to serve. To enter the cellar, one had to leap into it, and to get out, one had to climb up the wall. Still, the entrepreneuring Paysan cook had claimed his little space among all the destruction. To pass the time in that town, the poilus would occasionally go to see the regiments that had been relieved from the trenches the previous night. It was a sad spectacle, with men dragging themselves along the road alone or in groups. One soldier in particular collapsed at the side of the road, crushed with fatigue. His feet had been ravaged by the cold. The man begged for someone to fill his canteen with water from the nearest pump. Barthas immediately went to carry out his request. When he was returning, he saw the poor soldier being cursed at by a sergeant major that was demanding he return to the march. "Please," pleaded the soldier, "I'm sick and my feet are half frozen. I just need to rest for a moment." This only angered the sergeant, who started shaking the private by the shoulders and threatening him with a citation for disobedience. Barthas couldn't hold his anger. He approached the sergeant and said, "Sir, you should not act like this in the middle of a regiment from the Midi. We are too proud to tolerate this." The enraged sergeant turned towards him. "Do you know who you are talking to? You'd better shut up." Barthas replied, "Yes, I can see your sergeant major's stripes, but even if you were a general, I tell you that regulations clearly forbid you from laying hands on a subordinate, especially if he claims he's sick. That's the business of the medical officer, not yours." "Is there a police station around here?" replied the sergeant. "To report me?" asked Barthas. "Thanks, but there is no police station in Hardecourt. Here you'll only find decent people." The exasperated sergeant major left, muttering some vain threats towards the poilus. Barthas exchanged a handshake to the sick man before he returned to his march, accompanied by one of his comrades. Later, news arrived that the battalion was due to head up to the front line on the 24th of November. So, the day before that, Barthas made his way to the reserve trench near Comble to get the orders for his group from Lieutenant Loriot. Near the trench, in the middle of a field, he could see what the English called a tank, a large machine of steel that no longer moved. A big howitzer shell had penetrated it without detonating, and now its hull was used as shelter by a lucky squad of poilus. The large hole left by the shell served as a chimney through which escaped the smoke of the small fire that warmed the soldiers. Loriot explained to Barthas that the English tank had sown terror and death among the Germans and helped in taking the town. But it broke down on its way back from the enemy lines. The English tried in vain to rescue their comrades, and eventually the tank went up in flames. It was said that the tankers had set the machine on fire instead of surrendering it to the Germans, which Barthas thought would have been pretty naive, as it wouldn't stop the Germans from eventually building their own tanks. There was also the possibility that it had simply been an accident, an explosion of the engine. Whatever the reason, after the flames and smoke had died down, 4 charred corpses were pulled out from the metal husk. Moving on, in order to save them fatigue, the lieutenant authorized Barthas and his team to use a 37mm gun that was already in position on the front lines, instead of moving up their own. Unfortunately, they wouldn't occupy the exact same spot, so it would be necessary to send a man to scout out where their new position was located, so he could guide them in moving the gun. This would involve scrambling for several hours through the mud in daylight, exposed to German machine guns and artillery, so no one volunteered and lots had to be drawn. The gun layer Coney was selected. Barthas wrote that Coney was actually one of the smartest men in the group. He went out to explore and discovered that their new positions were only a few hundred meters to their left. And so, on the 24th of November at 8 p.m., Barthas and his team relieved the gun at the front line, loaded it and its ammunition onto their shoulders, and left to find their new position, guided by Coney. But, after an hour of marching and stumbling through water and mud, they still had not spotted a trench. There was fog which made the night even darker, and they could no longer tell where they had come from or where they were going. They were lost. There was nothing to do but wait for daylight, and so they silently sprawled out in a shell hole and stayed there, immobile. They were soaked with sweat. Soon the temperature dropped to the point they were shivering. Shortly after that, rain started to fall and it did not stop. It was an awful night that felt eternal. No one said anything, and no one criticized Coney for having guided them badly. He was suffering just like them. Finally, daylight arrived, and Coney, to gain their forgiveness, went out on patrol. He finally found and led them to the Circe dugouts, which they recognized from their previous stay in the front line. They cleared the entrance to a shelter that seemed to still be solid enough, and set themselves up in it. They warmed themselves by a fire they managed to light and ate some of their rations. Then Barthas, as team leader, had to head out to find Lieutenant Loriot or the battalion command to get his orders, but they were nowhere to be seen. Since his last stay in the front line, the French had gained ground in the area. he discovered that the battalion had gone up to occupy the new front-line trenches the previous day. But even though the battalion had had guides, they'd gotten lost and only reached their positions by 4 a.m. Through the soldiers that had been relieved and were passing through the Circe trench, Barthas learned where he had to go. He asked for a volunteer to accompany him. No one wished to volunteer, and so lots were drawn again. This time, the gun loader Donadil was chosen, and the two of them headed out. It was daytime, but the heavy storm and fog allowed them to move unseen across open country. They followed the path of a communication trench that felt endless. Everywhere was marked with shell holes and corpses that had been left to the crows. Eventually, they reached a huge trench with solid dugouts that had belonged to the Germans and which now was their second line. Following another communication trench, they soon found Lieutenant Loriot, who was stuck in a small, unstable dugout that looked just about ready to collapse. The lieutenant consulted with the commandant and told them that with this downpour, which threatened to make the trenches uninhabitable, it would be better if Barthas's team stayed in the dugout they'd found until further orders. Fearing that the commandant might change his mind, Barthas and Donadil quickly left. The fog was no longer as thick as it had been before, and so they had to make their way back through the long communication trench, which was now flooded with water that often went up to their knees. They eventually reached their precious shelter and, to their great fortune, did not have to leave it for the next 5 days. During those 5 days, the torrential downpour and the snow did not let up for a single moment. Barthas wrote that no pen could ever describe the suffering and misery of the men in the trenches. One had to live through it to understand how infinite those days and nights felt. Every night, with their work details, men would have to move to and from the front line, and on their way, some men would fall into muddy shell holes full with water, and would not manage to climb out. They drowned or froze to death. Barthas wrote how his group was safe from all of this thanks to their 37mm cannon, which was useless in the rain. He wrote that whoever had invented the cannon could not imagine right then and there 4 privates and a corporal huddled in a hole in the middle of the Somme were blessing his name. Meanwhile, the task of the rationers was very difficult during those days. They only had vague directions with which to try and find their teams in that deluge. The first night, Barthas and his companions took turns standing watch for their arrival, but the rationers wandered for hours searching for them, and only found them the next morning. After that, they were supplied regularly except for one time, when the rationers were surprised by a sudden bombardment, and one of them lost his way. That man had been carrying their liquid rations, and so the team had to go 24 hours with food, but nothing to drink, though this was a minor annoyance in such circumstances. Their second day there, Barthas had to go up through the flooding trenches to receive orders from Lieutenant Loriot, but discovered that the shelter he had occupied had completely collapsed. The lieutenant had wisely judged that the shelter could not last any longer, and had taken off to some other unknown place. Barthas also discovered that the commandant had fallen sick and had been evacuated, so no one knew who commanded the battalion. The companies were cut off from one another. All the men could do was endure and wait. During those hellish days, Barthas and his team had the opportunity to help some soldiers who had lost their way, or who had been too exhausted and needed to rest. One night, they took care of a stretcher-bearer that collapsed into their shelter completely soaked in freezing water. The man had fallen into a large flooded shell hole, and was quite happy that he'd managed to climb out. The poilus gave him their blankets, let him rest, and dried his clothes before he went on his way. Another night, they took care of 2 other stretcher-bearers who were carrying an order to identify and bury all the bodies that were between the trench lines. This was a task that would have needed several full teams of stretcher-bearers. Instead, they only sent 2 men that trembled with fear at each explosion that shook the shelter. They went out several times into the darkness to bury the bodies, but always returned a short time afterwards. Eventually, they decided that they had buried as many as they could and left. At last, on the 29th of November, Barthas and his team learned through the rationers that the battalion would be relieved. They would have to leave with their cannon that very evening and head back to the town of Hardecourt. Barthas wrote that during their previous relief there had been 4 German cannons that would fire 4 shells at and around the Circe shelters every 5 minutes, like clockwork. Now there was only 1 cannon that continued to fire its single shell every 5 minutes. At night, the group got ready at the shelter's entrance. After a shell exploded, they headed out quickly to profit from the generous minutes of ceasefire. At an agreed-upon point on their path, they were given their mule Fallet, and then quickly left behind the danger zone. They reached Hardecourt at 7 p.m., and there found Sergeant Gauthier, who was quite happy at discovering that he had returned from his home leave right at the moment when the team was relieved from the trenches. The poilus spent that night under a big tent, which was called a marabout. A large number of these tents had been placed around the encampment, and though they did not protect well against the cold, at least they kept the rain and wind outside. And on this note, we shall leave this part of the 14th notebook, with the soldiers living in all the mud, rain, and snow of the hell that is the Somme. Only their first stay in its trenches has cost them hundreds in dead, wounded, and sick, and we shall see how things continue on the second part. For now, I hope you've all enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you next time. Have a good day.